Good afternoon and welcome. This public meeting for the City Transportation Plan update is an opportunity for you to learn the information in the draft plan. We do have some interactive polling during the process, and there will be more slides that will be available to share with you how you can participate if you're not logged on on your computer. During the presentation, if you do have any questions, please be advised that staff are monitoring the question and answer window. Questions asked through the window will be verbally addressed during the designated parts of the meeting when we address questions. We'll also address questions at the end of the meeting if there is not enough time during the polling and Q&A breaks that we take midstream. If we run short on time on questions, all of the questions will be responded to within a discussion summary. Comments submitted through the question and answer will be included in the meeting summary as well. And all this information is to be provided to our project team for consideration as they move forward through the planning process. Comments will not be verbally addressed during the meeting in the interest of time. Additional opportunities to provide feedback beyond participating in this meeting. Emails can be forwarded to me at my email address. That's ecooper@a2gov.org by November 13th. Again, I'll repeat that, ecooper@a2gov.org by November 13th. Thank you for choosing to spend some time here with us this afternoon. And I'll turn it back over to Kayla to cover some of the procedure slides. And then Stacy Meekins from Sam Schwartz will be providing the initial module of the information on the plan. Again, thank you for taking the time to join us. We look forward to hearing your feedback, and we will outline next steps later in the presentation.
Thank you, Eli. My name is Kayla Coleman. I am a community engagement specialist with the City of Ann Arbor, and I'm going to cover the technology overview that you should see on the slide in front of you. So thank you for joining this Zoom public meeting and for your patience as we adapt to the new technology and interact in a virtual capacity. So if you're new to Zoom or if you're on Zoom regularly, we want to make sure everyone is on the same page with knowing how to use the technology for their needs today. So we will be taking questions, as Eli said, throughout the meeting. There will be multiple points to provide feedback and questions, and you can do that by raising your hand to share a question or comment verbally. So there is a raise hand feature, which should be along the bottom of your screen. And when you click that, the raise hand will become blue. That will indicate to me that you have a question that you would like to ask, and I will call on you at the appropriate times within the meeting to ask a question. And I see someone has either has tested that hand raise or already has a question at this point, but we will get to questions shortly. So Matthew, please hold that question and we'll get back to you soon. If you would like to submit any feedback through the Q&A, you can do that also by clicking that icon from the bottom of your screen. There's a check mark to click if you would like to send that comment or question anonymously. You can do that, and then your name will not be associated with it. If you do not click that checkbox, the name that you provided when you entered the meeting is the name that will show within this meeting to the other participants. Will see that name associated with your comment or question, and then you click send. And as Eli said, staff are monitoring the Q&A as well, and those comments and questions will be addressed at those allotted points within the meeting. If anyone joins by phone, we will have accommodations for them as well. It looks like all of our participants are currently with us through a computer or smartphone, so we will move along from there. Thank you. Zoom meeting norms. So we want to make sure that today's meeting time will be used effectively, and that you will get, in order for you to get the most out of this meeting, we want to keep it productive and ensure that the meeting is conducted in an orderly fashion. So we do intend to start on time and end on time. That's to respect your time as well. We ask that you raise your hand with the Zoom feature to be recognized to talk. And please move to a quiet area if you're going to ask a verbal question so that we can ensure to limit background noise. Speak loudly and clearly so everyone can hear. And we're going to allow everyone a chance to speak or ask a question before repeat questions are addressed from the same person. So please be patient with that. Be respectful of others' ideas and perspectives. And please know that any inappropriate language, any verbal attacks would be cause for removal from the meeting. And so we do need to respect each other in those ways. And let us know if there's anything we've missed, any other ideas that you'd like to propose to ensure that this is an orderly meeting today. And if you have any questions about those meeting norms, you can submit that feedback in the Q&A window as well. In terms of follow-up expectations, we will provide a meeting summary no more than 2 weeks after the meeting. And as I stated at the very beginning, this meeting is being recorded and that will also be posted to the project website. The project team will submit deliverables in a timely manner. And just keep in mind that please, that public engagement is not a decision-making process. So while we're collecting feedback today and that will shape what goes into this transportation plan, we won't be making any official decisions in this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Kayla. And I just wanted to turn my video on at first to say hi. I'll turn it off to go through the majority of the presentation so it's not distracting. But I wanted to add a little bit of a personal touch at first, and thank you all for joining us today. As an overview of what we'll go over in this meeting, we're going to give a little bit of background on what Vision Zero is, because that really drove a lot of this process. We're going to go over the plan process and what got us to this point, and specifically the public and stakeholder engagement process that we went through. And then we're going to go through at a high level the strategies that have been developed for this plan. And at various points throughout, we will pause for a polling feature and some Q&A. So, what is Vision Zero? Vision Zero is both a goal and a strategy to eliminate fatalities and serious injuries caused by traffic crashes. It was developed originally in Sweden with the mindset that loss of life or a life-altering injury should not be a consequence of simply trying to get from one place to another. So it's a bold goal, but I mentioned it's also a strategy. It's a matter of changing the way we do business to focus primarily, first and foremost, on safety. So how do we get there? It really takes a multidisciplinary approach. So you'll see in the plan that we have strategies that cover a lot of different aspects. So we covered the 6 E's is what we call it: engineering, encouragement, evaluation. We'll get to all those different E's later in the presentation, but we want to make sure that we're not just focusing on engineering approaches to get to achieve Vision Zero. Another core tenet of Vision Zero is that we are making decisions based on what the data is telling us. So we're looking at specifically where are these severe crashes happening and what is causing them from a behavior standpoint. It also takes systems-based solutions. So we're not looking project by project. We are trying to set Ann Arbor up with this plan with ways to do things systematically to achieve Vision Zero. So you'll notice in the plan there are a number of toolboxes that just help the city make decisions on a recurring basis that improve safety. Vision Zero also has a strong focus on equity. And with that data-driven decision-making, that's paired with a targeted action plan so that we are very specifically focusing on certain strategies. So we have been working on this plan for over a year and a half, and I wanted to give you a high-level overview of what this plan process has entailed. So the whole process is consolidated here on one slide, where we've organized it, summarized it in terms of 3 different phases that we went through. The first phase being a discovery phase, and what we were looking for in that phase was to learn about the opportunities and challenges in Ann Arbor and establish the goals and values for this plan. Off to the right, you see the components of that phase, and in that darker amber color are basically the tasks that we as a project team were undertaking. So we were really looking at data during that phase and understanding what the data was telling us. In the next column, that goldish color, those were the stakeholder engagement components. So we did a staff values workshop. We met with 2 committees. I'll give you an overview of the committees in a couple minutes. And we met with the Transportation Commission. And then those green boxes all the way on the right are the components that were involved public engagement. So in this phase, we had several focus groups. We launched an online survey to understand transportation behaviors. We launched another online survey to focus on level of comfort as you're bicycling. We held 1 public open house and 2 pop-up meetings. The next phase is what we call the ideation phase. So in that phase, we are developing ideas for projects, and we're vetting them at not just projects, but also programs and policies. And we're vetting them with the public and with the stakeholders and figuring out what works here in Ann Arbor. So on our end, we are looking at best practices from across the country. We're looking at how can we apply those here in Ann Arbor, and beginning to develop a really long list of strategies that we then narrow in on and refine. So in that ideation phase, we worked again with staff on a workshop for corridors and intersections. We came back to committees and the Transportation Commission to vet these ideas. And we held another public open house, launched 3 more online surveys that had specific focuses. One was a corridor preferences survey that mirrored an activity we did at the open house. We launched an online survey focused on pedestrian crossings and one on the bike network. And then at the last phase is the action planning phase. So we take all those ideas and we organize them into a set of strategies that will help Ann Arbor achieve these primary goals. So we're at the tail end of that phase now. We have worked with the committees to refine the strategies, organize them into short, medium, and long-term timelines. We're here at this virtual open house to get your feedback as well, and we'll continue to refine the document. So just a little bit more about those different phases. In the discovery phase, we zeroed in on 2 planned goals, that moving together towards towards 0 deaths and 0 emissions. So Vision Zero was part of the directive even prior to us joining this team. And that was kind of laid out as a goal that we needed to adopt and help Ann Arbor get to. In the meantime, A20 was adopted, and we accepted that as something that we need to work together towards. So a lot of the mobility related strategies from A20 have been incorporated into this document. So in that discovery phase, I mentioned that we did a lot of data analysis. What we found is that Ann Arbor has been very active in making improvements to increase transit ridership, increase people walking and biking, and lower emissions. But the city has some bold goals, and the community has some bold visions for Ann Arbor, and so we still need to make some progress to meet those two bold goals of 0 deaths and 0 emissions. And if you've followed along on our process, you may remember in the first public open house, we were asking about the values that should guide this plan. And we refined those along with the committees, and ended up with 5 values that should guide the plan. Those being safety, mobility, accessibility for all, healthy people and sustainable places, and regional connectivity. Next, in that ideation phase, I mentioned that we did some best practices research. We brought those ideas to the committees and vetted them and thought about what would work well here in Ann Arbor, and then started to apply those. So we have several concept designs for focus corridors and focus intersections. These are really intended to get Ann Arbor, the city, started on some actions following this plan. And then in this final phase, the action plan phase, we refined the strategies and organized them into what we called 22 key strategies. Those were the ones that were identified by the committees and the staff as having the most promise in helping the city achieve its goals. Each strategy does include an indication of how it relates to the values that were identified by the public and the community, and also what type of strategy it is. I mentioned the 6 E's earlier. So some of them are engineering focused. They may have an education focus, an encouragement focus, enforcement, equity, or evaluation. A lot of these strategies, I should also note, are not just related to one value or even one discipline. So they do cross-cut these values and cross-cut disciplines. We've also noted with each strategy if it should be started in the short term, medium term, and long term. Now, I will note that that timeline is based on when a strategy should be started, and not to suggest that necessarily that each strategy in that time frame needs to be completed in that time frame. I also wanted to review the public and stakeholder engagement process that we went through. I've mentioned already quite a bit that the committees that guided the development of this plan. We had 2 overarching committees. One was a technical advisory committee that consisted of 22 members representing city and partner agencies. We also had a community advisory committee with 30 active members representing a broad base of community groups. We met with each of those committees on 4 occasions. The first time to kick off the project, talk about the process and what Vision Zero is, and start talking about those goals and values. The second meeting, we reviewed what we found in the existing conditions analysis, and then started talking about those best practices that we've found from across the country and how to apply them in Ann Arbor. The third meeting was really focused on what strategies would move Ann Arbor forward. And then the final round of meetings last week to review the draft plan. With the public engagement activities, I mentioned most of these events already, but just wanted to give you a little bit more on them. For that initial transportation behavior survey, we were very excited to see such a high response rate. We had over 1,800 responses. We did some additional online engagement throughout. In October 2019 for the bicycle, what type of bike rider are you? How that was the bicycle comfort level, online engagement, and then I mentioned these other three already, focusing on corridors, pedestrian crossings, and a proposed low stress bike network. And these are just some examples of some images from those meetings and some key takeaways, just to jog your memory or give you a little bit more background if you weren't able to participate in those. In our first public meeting, we asked people what kinds of treatments they liked from some examples from across the country. This exercise focused on the focus corridors that we are looking at here in Ann Arbor. And so now we are going to do a little polling session. I'm going to switch my screen and ask you all if you are able to, either through a smartphone or a internet browser on your computer, if you can go to menti.com and type in the code that you see at the top, 7047607. If you are not able to participate in the poll using a phone or a computer and you want to answer these questions, we do ask that you stay on the line after the meeting and we can go through these questions with you separately. So this is what your screen will look like if you are using your phone. This is what your screen will look like if you are using a computer. The code will remain at the top of the screen throughout. We are going to keep coming back to this Mentimeter system a couple points throughout. So once we're done with this particular polling session, you can leave that open if you're able to. So let's get started. Just so I know how many people are able to engage with this, if you could click on the heart, which you'll either find in the bottom right corner if you're on your phone or in the center of your screen if you're on a computer. And we'll just give people a couple more seconds to log in.
So Stacy, while people are logging in, I'd like to just take this moment to recognize, acknowledge, and thank. We have two city council members, Councilmember Lum and Council Member Griswold, who have joined us here today. Thank you for spending some of your time with us at this public meeting.
Okay, thank you. Like I said, this code will always remain at the top of the screen if you join late. The first couple questions are really kind of just to get us acquainted with the system. So I think we could get started. What is your favorite way to get around? I have participated in public engagement for this plan. You can choose online, in person, or neither. And you can also choose two options. So if you did it, that's why you don't see a both option. You can click on online and in person if you did both. Okay, thank you. We are actually going to go back to a presentation and we'll come back to this polling in a few minutes. So I wanted to give you an overview first of the plan document itself in case you have not had a chance to look at it online. So I mentioned the key strategies. For each key strategy, we have in the upper left, the very beginning of the strategy, we've kind of given a shorthand of what that strategy is, and then a full description, full sentence of that strategy below it. We've laid out the current state of where Ann Arbor is on that particular issue, and then what we're actually proposing through a strategy description. And these all have varying lengths and detail. Across the top, we identify which of those values it speaks to. And then with each strategy, we've also identified a timeline and which agencies should be leading that or involved in that, as well as targets for each strategy. In addition to those key strategies, we do have a longer list of full strategies that we want to make sure that as a comprehensive plan, these are very important as well. And the full matrix of 75 strategies is included after the key strategies. So the key strategies are repeated in there just so that everything is found together. But these are organized by timeline. So first is a long list of short-term strategies, followed by medium-term, and then long-term. And even in this matrix, we've identified the lead and partner agencies, the values that it speaks to, which E's are part of that strategy, and the targets. And one of the things that we'll go through today are the metrics there are targets at each strategy level. And then there are performance metrics that we are suggesting the city track on a value level. And what we're looking for when we lay out these performance metrics are these four things: that the metric be valid, that it's accurately measuring that result, that it be reliable, that this is something that doesn't change over time, and that like year to year you can compare the results, that it be simple, that it be something that's easy enough to track, that we have the data to do so and we have the resources to be able to measure it. And finally, that it's meaningful, that if that measure improves, that means that we're really improving mobility and improving the lives of people in Ann Arbor. We did have a round of committee meetings last week, and so I just wanted to also touch on a couple updates that you'll see in the plan based on some feedback that we got through those meetings. One was that there should be an increased emphasis on speed limit reduction. Speed limit reduction is already a strategy in the plan, but elevating that importance and maybe giving a little bit more background on that. There were several questions about equity and how this plan is addressing equity in the plan. And what we realized is that while those strategies are in the plan, they're kind of sprinkled throughout. It's not a core section, or not a section in and of itself. So what we'll do is pull those out so that it's easily identified. And then finally, inclusion of the connector. A lot of work has been done on that over the years, and so we'll add a little bit of background on that project. So we do have a lot of strategies. We are not going to be able to go through all of them here in this meeting, but what we'll do for each value is go over some highlights and then do another polling session at 3 segments throughout the meeting. So I mentioned already that with Vision Zero, it's a very data-driven approach, and we want to focus our resources specifically where these severe crashes are happening. So one of the first things we did was look at on a corridor basis and on an intersection level basis, where are those geographically throughout the city? So we identified what we called Tier 1 corridors and intersections and Tier 2 corridors and intersections. And these are the areas where we would like to see a focus on improving conditions with a safety focus in mind. So that could be done in a number of different ways. It could be done through specific new capital improvement projects, by coordinating with other planned projects or construction work, by advancing ongoing studies that are already in the works, such as the South State Street Corridor Plan, and through the use of quick build safety programs to implement changes in the immediate term, which is another strategy in and of itself. So a lot of these strategies also work in tandem. They are not necessarily standalone. So with respect to the focus corridors and intersections, we did select a subset of those to look at through our study and have included some concept plans for several of those. In addition to focusing geographically, we do also want to focus on dangerous behaviors that lead to serious crashes. So I also mentioned that systems-based approach where we have developed several toolboxes through this plan to allow Ann Arbor to use these strategies time and again. So this is the first example of that type of toolbox where we're addressing dangerous behaviors based on using both engineering tools, but also education and encouragement tools. So the ones that are, some of the ones that are included here include setting speed limits on a lowering speed limits or setting safer speed limits, focusing traffic calming interventions on major streets. The city already does a lot on local streets, but expanding that to major streets. And also specifically targeting left turning maneuvers. And then on the education and encouragement side, some examples of things that were included are a messaging campaign, driver training, and impaired driver education. Again, with respect to where to focus, we have a strategy in here specifically about making intersections safer and easier to navigate for biking. We did find that 80% of those killed or seriously injured when on a bike were at intersections. So while there is a separate strategy for building out a bike network, we also wanted to call out specifically where there are intersections that need particular focus. And another key strategy is establishing this quick build program, which I alluded to a couple of slides ago. And this also includes a little bit of a toolbox to show what types of treatments could be part of that quick build program. But the idea behind a quick build program is that you're using pretty inexpensive materials that can be implemented at low cost, but also very quickly. So you see here some painted bump outs that make the crossing shorter, some painted bike intersection treatments, even a protected bike lane that was installed using bollards and planters. The idea behind this quick build program is that we don't want to wait necessarily for a long design and construction process to make a few really critical safety improvements if we don't have to. And so this is a way you can make those safety improvements in the immediate term while you are designing and planning for longer term improvements. So at the safety value level, I mentioned that we have targets for each strategy, but we also want the city to be looking and being able to report at a high level, how are we doing? So these are the metrics that we propose to track progress on safety. The first being that the annual number of people killed and seriously injured in traffic crashes is reduced to 0 by 2025. I mentioned already that this was already a goal of the city before this project started. But the second one focuses on tracking the share of serious injuries and fatalities that are incurred by people walking and biking, because they are disproportionately affected currently. And then since we do have a specific focus on targeting dangerous behaviors, we thought that would be a critical thing to track as well. So looking at the share of serious injury and fatalities caused by those dangerous driving behaviors. And then that final one focuses on tracking the actions of the city. So the proposed metric here is to track the number of safety improvements installed per year. So with respect to mobility, some of the key strategies here are building out what we call an all ages and abilities bike network. So what that means is it's a bike facility that is really comfortable for an 8-year-old, and it is comfortable for an 80-year-old, and everybody in between. So we have a network that is proposed on the right, but we also paired that again with a toolbox to help the city figure out what is the appropriate facility to make a certain street comfortable enough. We're also looking at improving mobility for people walking, and the critical link in somebody's walking path is often being able to cross the street safely. And so focusing on crosswalks and specifically some new uncontrolled crosswalk locations as proposed here. From a transit perspective, prioritizing the reliability and speed along signature corridors and at specific locations. So we know that there are some pinch points where transit vehicles maybe get bogged down or get tied up in congestion. So looking at specific strategies to help the buses move along and stay on a reliable timetable. Some things included are transit signal priority, bus only lanes, or queue jumps where they're able to bypass a queue at a red light and get through an intersection quicker. Focusing on signature corridors. I apologize for the fuzziness of this table, but what we're looking at is State Street Fuller Road, Plymouth Road, Washington Avenue, Jackson Avenue, and Huron Street, and increasing frequencies to make sure that each of these signature transit corridors have a frequency of 15 minutes or better throughout the weekday and on Saturdays. Shared mobility is an increasingly popular option in many cities. So partnering with shared mobility providers to expand those options is another strategy included in here. Part of the reasoning behind this strategy is that the 47% of trips in urban areas in Michigan are less than 3 miles. Those are the easy trips to convert from driving to walking or biking or potentially using a scooter, other ways to get around that don't emit any carbon emissions, that are safer and create safer streets in general. And then when it comes to driving, what we found is that the delay, the congestion in Ann Arbor is really concentrated during those commute times, the morning and evening rush hours. And so by really focusing on several select corridors and using technology to our advantage, in addition to shifting mode share out of cars so there's less congestion on those corridors overall, that will increase efficiency for those driving. So for the mobility value, how we're proposing to track progress is to look at the population that is within a quarter mile of that all ages and abilities bike network and reach a target of 97% by 2030, which is now at 51%. And for transit, looking at the population that lives within a quarter mile of a high frequency transit corridor, increasing that percentage from the 26% that are within that boundary today up to 66% by 2025. Looking at the share of trips made in the city by walking, biking, and transit, and increasing that from 36% to 50% by 2025. And then increasing the availability of shared mobility vehicles. So that includes car share, as well as bike share and e-scooters, from 330 today up to 1,000 by 2025. So this is just an overview, again, to remind you of what we're thinking about to develop those metrics, the validity of them, reliability, simplicity, and meaningfulness. And now I am going to go back to our polling screen and let you all weigh in on those. So if you wouldn't mind hitting that heart button again, that gives me an idea of how many people are back in the polling software.
Stacy, we had at least one participant who was unable to launch their Mentimeter. So if you could just quickly remind folks where to go and where the code is to enter so that they can actively participate in the polling. Thank you.
Yes, sure. So if you are able to open a browser, an internet browser, either on your phone or on a computer, and you can type in www.menti.com. That should take you to a screen where it asks you for a code. And the code is 7047607. Okay. So we just have a couple of questions related to the metrics that we are proposing. So we're asking, do you support each of the following safety metrics? So I will read them off. There's actually an additional one here based on input that we got from the committees last week. So were all included in the slide that I just went over, but I will read them off here. We have the annual number of people killed or seriously injured in crashes, the share of serious injuries and fatalities incurred by people walking and biking, the share of serious crashes related to dangerous driving behaviors, the number of safety improvements installed each year, and the percent of streets by mile that have a speed limit of 25 miles per hour or less. So we'll give you all a few minutes to weigh in on that. Okay. Now we'll move on to the, excuse me, the mobility metrics. So do you support each of the following mobility metrics? We have the population within a quarter mile of the all ages and abilities bike network, the population within a quarter mile of a high frequency transit route, the share of trips made by walking, biking, and transit, and the number of shared mobility vehicles available. Okay, thank you all. Now we are going to go into a Q&A session, and I will turn it over to Robert.
Thank you, Stacy. Good afternoon, everybody. just so there is a name to the voice you hear, my name is Robert Keller. I'm a communications specialist with the City of Ann Arbor. Stacy and the team, there have been lots of written questions and comments regarding speed limit and enforcement. To kind of wrap all these up, maybe you guys could take just a minute to talk about what options are available for what we're talking about as far as enforcement of speed limits, existing speed limits, and then possibly reducing speed limits. And then some people have commented how that might impact with state law.
Yes, sorry, I got off this. There we go. So how does speed limit impact, how is it enforcement factored in, and how does it impacted by state law?
Correct. A lot of people are pointing out that reducing speed limits may not be an option, and then asking us if the plan focuses on enforcement and behavior.
So there are some options currently to reduce speed limits in Ann Arbor. There are also some limitations to that based on current state laws. And we are working with MDOT. They are part of the Technical Advisory Committee as well, working on how do we structure our strategies to both address that and be able to work within it, but also focus on how could Ann Arbor take some steps to changing state laws in order to also then be able to enact the strategies they want to see on their streets. So for instance, there are some limitations to what the city can do currently on streets that are under MDOT jurisdiction. That said, this long-range plan is an important venue for putting forth the community's values and vision, and making that a statement that they hope to see certain things, and then being able to work with the state where they maybe can't enact certain strategies yet, but be able to work towards that in the long term.
Okay. And I know this next question, one that we've gotten quite a bit, is does the plan, the Vision Zero initiative, take in COVID-19 into consideration, since there will be many short and medium term changes in how we interact, plan, and design regarding COVID?
Yes, I mean, we have talked about how does COVID impact this plan. Again, this is being a long-range plan. What we felt was that rooting this plan in the goals and values, those goals and values remain the same regardless of COVID-19. And in fact, COVID-19, I think, has highlighted the need to be able to have different options, maybe have destinations closer to your home, and be able to access resources, which is one of the specific strategies that we will get to later in the presentation about having those land uses nearby. And I think also with the quick build strategy, that we've seen is another important resource for cities to have, especially during COVID-19. We've seen a lot of cities, Ann Arbor included, adjusting how they use their streets and opening them up to be able to allow more walking and biking in the street, and just be a little bit more flexible on how that street is used.
All right, and just a couple more to wrap together here. Folks are asking about essentially pedestrian and electronic enforcement. So as the question I'm sure we've heard many times is about jaywalking laws, as they call it, and also electronic means to enforcement. Is that being considered at all in these plans?
Yes, we do have automated enforcement as one of the toolboxes, one of the tools in the toolbox for addressing dangerous behaviors. That is one of the things that is currently limited by state law. But part of the strategy is to advocate for changes to that law to enable the use of automated enforcement.
Thank you, Stacy. And Robert, while you are reviewing the Q&A log, I'm going to go ahead and allow a verbal question to be asked. So we have a hand raise from Raisa, and I'm going to mark you as enabled to speak. You'll need to unmute yourself and then ask your question. Please remember to keep this brief. We have a lot of questions to get through today and a lot more presentation material to cover. So Raisa, you should now be able to unmute yourself, and please go ahead and ask your question. Raisa, do you have a question for us? We can hear that you're unmuted, but we aren't hearing your question come through yet. Okay, it looks like we're having some audio qualities there, Raisa. Sorry about that. I'm going to disable your microphone now and lower your hand. If you'd like to submit your question in the Q&A, we'll look at it there, and we can try again later if you're able to resolve the audio issues. Jeff Crockett, I now have, let me go ahead and allow you to speak. You can unmute yourself and ask your question. Go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
So I wrote an email expressing this concern earlier today to the group and also voiced this question, but because there appears to be very little attention paid to biker negligence and bad behavior. And as a pedestrian and as a motorist, I've seen bicyclists do very inappropriate things. And when I raise this issue to a police officer, the problem is how you report this. And not just that, it's very unclear what biker responsibilities currently are. So it seems to me that part of this session to improve safety has to involve bicyclists.
Thank you, Jeff. So it sounds like you've expressed some interest in both education for bicyclists on the appropriate behaviors when cycling and also the enforcement associated with that. And I think that those are things the project team can take into consideration. Stacy, please chime in if there's anything you'd like to address there. Hearing nothing there from Stacy, I think we'll take that feedback from Jeff. We appreciate that. And David, I've now enabled you to speak. Please go ahead and unmute yourself, then ask your question.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. So I'm having trouble. I work in town. I'm a builder, and I travel, and my guys travel back and forth all the time, and we're having a lot of trouble getting across downtown because of all the lanes that are blocked off, especially on Division. And I'm wondering if the city has considered making the bike highway go down 4th Avenue instead, which would get it out of the main arteries that drivers use and allow the bikes to be further away from drivers and still get across town and get to the Williams bike lanes that have been put in as well. And actually, it's also closer to the new viaduct that comes from Argo.
Thank you, David. And it looks like you also had submitted a written feedback on that item as well, I believe, regarding the location of the bike cycle track being 4th Avenue. Is that something, Stacy, that you'd like to address at this time?
I was gonna actually see if Eli or anybody from the city wanted to talk about that. That's
Yeah, so I'll just quickly identify that the current People Friendly Streets initiative, the second part of the comment related to division, was guided by the DDA and the mobility and accessibility that was necessary in and around the downtown area. The city staff coordinates with the DDA as they had moved forward with this pilot that they ran on division. With regard to fourth, we would work collaboratively with the DDA. We appreciate your nomination, but you've also outlined in your thought the fact that there are trade-offs in all modal changes or assignments within the downtown district. And given the proximity and the familiarity that the DDA staff has with the individual merchant associations and the constituencies within the downtown, we would be coordinating closely with them as we take your input under advisement. Thank you for that input.
Thanks, Eli, for that. And Stacy, did you want to come back to that question we had from Jeff about the bicyclist education and enforcement? I see your response. You were not able to unmute quickly enough.
well, I was just going to concur with you. We can take those. I thought you summed it up well, Kayla, and we'll take that into consideration.
Wonderful. Thank you. And we've got a few more hand raises. Again, just if we can keep these brief so we get through as many as possible. Dan, you are now enabled to speak. Please unmute yourself and ask your question. That's Dan Mullen. You are enabled to speak. Please unmute yourself. All right, Dan, I've disabled speaking and lowered your hand. If you want to come back with another question, we can revisit that. There's a participant with the name KJMC. KJMC, you've been enabled to speak. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, this is actually Ken Clark. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Great. I have a concern that I didn't see addressed in the plan, and that's that our traffic signal system currently discriminates against cyclists. When there's signal progression, the progression speeds are set so fast that cyclists can't match them. A lot of the signals that are detected loops don't have any place marked on the pavement for a cyclist to be detected. And it's not clear that even if you have some idea of where that is, it will actually detect you. Is there any plan to move Ann Arbor's signal system to something that cyclists can actually trigger and actually get green lights as often as motorists do? Thanks.
Great, thank you, Ken. Appreciate you framing those questions. So related to the signal progression, such that it's timed for bicyclists and also signal detection, is that being considered in the plan? Stacy, could you address that?
Yeah, we can look at, I mentioned we have a specific strategy focused on intersections. So we can review that strategy and see how that your suggestions would fit in there.
Great,
And
go ahead,
Kayla,
Eli.
this is Eli. Just with regard to bicycle detection, as technology advances, both in road monitors and alternative ways of measuring the presence of pedestrians, bicyclists, and vehicles is advancing, and the city is investing resources to make our signaling system responsive to all users.
Great, thank you, Eli. And Larry Deck. Larry, you've been enabled to speak. Please unmute yourself and ask your question. Thank you.
Yeah, what's the procedure for translating the philosophies in the plan into built projects?
Okay, Stacy, is that something you'd like to take? How will we be translating these philosophies into built projects?
So to start, I mean, we have the focus corridors and intersections called out, and we would recommend that the city start there. And we have, I mentioned, developed concept designs for several of those. You're only seeing a subset of the concept designs in the plan right now. The additional ones will be included in the appendix. And so that would, that provides a fair amount of action for physical improvements. And we also have those unmarked crosswalks identified. We have a whole bike network identified. So one other thing that we'll be working on for the final draft of the plan is actually a map that consolidates all of those capital improvement recommendations to visualize it in the plan.
Let me, again, this is Eli, and I just want to add on with regard to the city's capital improvement programming process. There is a prioritization that enables us to pick the various parameters that we assign priority for as we value our investments, and some of the philosophies that are described in this plan with regard to safety, mobility, equity are parameters that are used in our capital improvements programming process as well. So Stacy is on point with immediate projects that are outlined, but the philosophies that are in the plan will also affect the prioritization of a variety of projects that might be outside of even the transportation realm. Thank you.
Thanks, Eli. And I'm going to allow Clark Ternetsky to ask a question, and then I'll turn it back over to Robert to wrap up our Q&A. Clark, you've been enabled to speak. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi. Around page 100, there's a mention about the Amtrak service, but I think there's a need for other intercity services to be listed. For example, Greyhound, Millers, and Barron's intercity buses use the current Amtrak station. Perhaps there should be a section on intercity transportation to include air rides, since that's an intermodal service, Amtrak, intercity buses, U of M connector, and perhaps the D2A2 buses. That's it.
Great, thank you, Clark. Appreciate that. So Stacy, perhaps your team can consider incorporation of some intercity bus references in the plan. If there's anything you'd like to comment on that now, please do. Otherwise, back to you, Robert.
I think, Clark, that's a good comment. We do have some of those referenced in the plan already, but we can look to the additional examples that you called out as well.
Yes, and again, I know we have a lot of written questions, and I apologize if we can't get them to them all. So I'm trying to get the most significant, but we will try to answer them all, whether it's written or in the live discussion. Stacy, the question we also got was, can we speak to the collaborations that we have been doing with the Ann Arbor Public Schools and the University of Michigan for the plan? If you could speak to that.
Yes, so we had representation from both on the committees. We actually had specific surveys targeting students at the university, and actually a separate kind of project that we were about to launch with the Ann Arbor Public School System. And that was right before COVID-19 lockdowns happened, so those actually could not move forward. But we did have representation from those groups throughout the process via the committees.
Thanks, Stacy. And one more question before we can move on in the presentation. And I'd like to ask Eli to chime in on this one, was a general discussion of the timeline for the plan moving forward, who it goes to next, and when does it go to council? If you could give a brief summary from that.
The final slide in the presentation deck will talk about next steps, but generally speaking, this is a part of the city's official master plan. We will follow the master plan adoption process. It'll go through Transportation Planning Commission review to City Council, out to the county, and then back to the Planning Commission for final adoption, and the City Council for ultimate acceptance of the language in the plan.
Okay, thank you all for those questions. We will, as Robert mentioned, we will continue to have some Q&A sessions, and we'll try to get to all of these questions. For those that we don't get to, if there are still some lingering questions, they will be answered in writing. on the website. So I am going to actually turn it over to my colleague, Jeremy, to run through strategies for accessibility for all and healthy people and sustainable places.
Thanks, Stacy, and hello, everyone. As Stacy said, I'm Jeremy Windsor. I work for a company called AECOM as a transportation planner, and we've been supporting Stacy and her team in the city on this planning effort. So I'm going to walk through some additional strategies related to a few of the other values that the plan is trying to address. Of course, many of these projects and strategies really kind of cut across many of the values, but we've tried to categorize them as closely as possible into kind of the main strategy that they are addressing. In this case, it's accessibility for all. So making sure that Ann Arbor has a transportation system that is accessible across all modes, across all ages and incomes as well. So that's demographic accessibility as well as kind of modal accessibility. One thing that the city has been working on for a number of years and continues to have work to do is about addressing gaps in the sidewalk system. I believe the city's been keeping track of this, and there's more than 100 miles still of gaps along city streets that do not have complete sidewalk systems. Our work during this planning project has identified 10 miles of real near-term gaps that kind of are critical needs to address. As you can imagine, many of the gaps that still exist are those that might be the toughest to actually fill at this point. The plan recommends that we look at, or that the city looks at ways to potentially fill those gaps using other means, such as what's shown in the picture there of creating accessible pedestrian paths that might not be the standard treatment of a sidewalk. We can move on to the next, Stacy. Another aspect of accessibility, as I mentioned, is making sure that things like the transit system or shared mobility assets are available to a wide cross-section of people, and especially the people who need mobility the most. So another strategy that's discussed is providing reduced fares for qualified users. 40% of the transit riders today make less than $25,000 a year. So looking at expanding things like the reduced fare program that the AAATA offers to seniors and those with disabilities, and also making sure that we're thinking about ways to make those services more accessible to a wide cross-section of those who need it. Kind of in a similar vein is just making sure that there's continued opportunities for people to be engaged in the process. Events like this are great for a large, broad strategy, but on the ground improvements and requests for improvements to the transportation system, the city needs to continue to find ways to hear from voices that aren't always heard from within the neighborhoods, and developing equitable and just engagement programs. Another aspect of accessibility recognizes that in some places within the city, especially the downtown, there's really kind of an imbalance today. More than a third of the space downtown is currently allocated for cars. And even though most of the activity downtown is really dedicated to people. And so finding ways to share some of that space more with people. I think the Streets for People program that the DDA has been working on starts to move in that direction, but the plan here indicates some ideas around developing some shared street implementations in some of those places where pedestrians really outnumber cars for most of the day. So again, for each of these values, we're trying to identify metrics and some targets for those metrics. So in the case of accessibility for all, looking at transportation costs overall as a percentage of household income. Now we estimate for Ann Arbor, that's 18%. We want to continue to make investments that drive down the cost to Ann Arbor residents, looking to hit a target of 15% by 2025. The average number of jobs that are within 20 minutes via different modes, such as active modes such as transit and bike. Right now, with citywide, depending on how you measure that, about 30,000 jobs are within convenient transit access and 15,000 bike. Looking to increase that by 2030 by some of the improvements to the networks that Stacy described in the previous slides. The share of bus stops that are ADA accessible. The ride has been, in the city, have been working on this for a number of years and getting pretty close, but not quite there in terms of those that are accessible to those with disabilities. So trying to get from that 89% to 100%. And then, as I mentioned, the miles of gaps in the sidewalk network, cutting those down to less than 8 over the long term, which is out to 2040. Another value in the plan is healthy people and sustainable places. And what we're talking about there and some of the strategies that we're talking about there really start to get into things that blend the transportation system with larger systems within the city, such as land use. So one concept that's discussed is the 20-minute neighborhood, which is that people have the ability to actually live, work, and play or go to school within 20 minutes of their house. Ann Arbor does a pretty good job of this so far, but there are corners of the city where access to those types of services and recreational facilities are not universal. A lot of this comes down to zoning code updates by mixing uses in residential areas, adding more quality to some of those elements. You're able to create places that are accessible within 20 minutes. Another strategy, as has been brought up, I think, in the Q&A and in previous parts of the slide, is that much of the transportation demand is really kind of peak oriented, especially in the PM peak, but also in the AM peak times of the day. And one strategy that many cities have embraced is by looking at ways to price trips in and out of the city according to how much strain they put onto the system during different times of the day. The main tool that the city has at their disposal to do this now is parking. So potentially exploring or piloting variable pricing schemes where you could look at higher pricing during some of those high demand times of the day, but also potentially even studying things like congestion pricing or road user fees that discourage people from traveling during those key times. Speaking of parking, not only on the pricing side, but also in terms of how much parking is required throughout the city. Looking at the development code to remove parking minimums, especially in highly transit served locations, and then even establishing parking maximums in some of those same places associated with private development. So when we're talking about metrics and targets that affect healthy people in sustainable places, we're looking at things like the number of vehicle miles traveled per day. This reflects a target that was in some of the A20, the sustainability planning that's been done by the city to reduce overall vehicular travel in and around Ann Arbor. And so this plan is currently showing a similar target as to that for consistency. The share of the population living in those kind of 20% or 20-minute neighborhoods, I'm sorry. Right now, we forecast about 80% of the city falls within that designation, but looking to find ways to get it up to 100% by 2030. And then the share of the population that is able to or that currently meets physical activity guidelines. This is something that can be measured through survey data, continuing to move that up from a pretty high proportion today of 84% to 95% or more by 2030. So similar to the exercise that we just did a handful of minutes ago when Stacy finished speaking, we're looking for some feedback on some of these metrics. So I think, Stacy, you're going to be pulling up the Mentimeter again.
Yes, and I saw a comment to repeat the code. The code is at the top of the screen if you can see the screen, but I will also repeat it verbally. So if you are not in the Mentimeter right now, you can go to www.menti.com and the code to enter is 70476 And again, we ask that you hit the heart button. So once you're at the screen that says accessibility and healthy people, sustainable places, so we have a sense of how many people are back engaged with the mental poll.
And I do see that we have a call-in participant on the line now, and the Mentimeter poll unfortunately is set up only to work through a web browser. So if you are able to get to a computer or smartphone and visit the Mentimeter site that Stacy has just referenced, please do. Otherwise, you're welcome to stay on the line when the meeting wraps up today, and we'd be happy to get your feedback and record that through a verbal conversation when the meeting wraps up today. Thank you.
So similar as to before, I think we're looking for input for those that are able to access the Menti system on each of these accessibility metrics, the ones that were that I went through previously, on whether you think these are good metrics, very much support those metrics, and things that the city should be striving for in terms of targets, or not really. So I see a handful of responses coming in already. Okay. And then these are a different set of metrics. These were the ones associated with the healthy and sustainable places metric. Just 3 on the screen here. Average vehicle miles traveled per day, share of the population living in 20-minute neighborhoods, and the share of the population that meet physical activity guidelines. Looks like we're up over 20 now.
Okay, so we can turn it back over to Robert, who will administer another Q&A session.
Thank you, Stacy. Had trouble finding my own unmute button there for a moment. So a couple of the questions we're now getting focus on the current bike lane configuration of the city and how they end or don't appear in other locations. So Stacy, if you could address the current bike lane situation and how this plan goes to address those inconsistencies.
Sorry, so just so I understand the question, it was about bike lanes not connecting?
Correct, in essence.
So what we've built out is a proposed network for that all ages and abilities bike network, as I mentioned in the previous slide. I think what I would say in terms of bike routes that don't connect currently, the focus is definitely on establishing a full network that provides connectivity throughout the city, and that just takes time to build out. I don't know if anybody from the city wants to elaborate on any of the existing routes.
I don't see the list of specific routes. I would point out that the city of Ann Arbor is a mature urban framework with existing land use, existing rights of way, and that we have limits. So unfortunately, although our existing transportation plan speaks to having a connected bicycle lane system, sometimes the resources necessary to make the changes needed to connect the system are beyond our capacity. However, the recommendation in the plan is to continue to put priority on connecting the system, and that as we've gone forward over time, we have much more of a connected system, meaning fewer gaps. And hopefully by the time this plan is sunset some decade from now, hopefully there will be no gaps left to be filled.
Just to add on to that, I think the bicycle and pedestrian design and planning fields have really rapidly innovated over the last 5 to 10 years. So communities have more tools to create those routes than we used to. And so I think what we've tried to do in this plan is guide the city on how to use those tools that are available, identify them, identify where they are appropriate, you know, what type of street, from a minor street up to a major street, so that we are able to pair the right strategy and fill those gaps.
Eli, you may want to take a shot at this one because this is more of a general planning question. But the question about what about allowing commercial shopping services in neighborhood areas to reduce travel times and congestion and travel?
Well, since you called me out, I will point to the recommendation in the plan that speaks to the 20-minute neighborhood. So without getting into the specifics of a particular street or particular zoning classification, the overall acknowledgement is that having multi-use neighborhoods that include commercial is an important ingredient in enabling active transportation, meaning walking, bicycling, short trips. And so that is clearly a highlight of a policy in this document.
And going back to bike lanes briefly, we have a question regarding any plans to put bike routes away from commuter routes.
Yes, we do have a number of routes that follow more local streets called out in the plan. We did try to focus on those low stress routes, and a lot of times those major commuter streets are harder to get to that comfort level of being qualified as low stress. So we did try to incorporate some additional routes through neighborhoods. And in some cases, the commuter route is still the most efficient and effective route to get over some barriers. So it's a mix.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Robert. This is Kayla Coleman again, Community Engagement Specialist, and we do have a hand raised currently. I also want to review the instructions for how you can unmute yourself to ask a question, particularly for our phone in caller. So if you are joining us by phone and you'd like to ask a question, please press *9 on your keypad, and that will signal that you have raised your hands. You will be identified by the last 3 digits of your phone number, and we can enable you to speak in order to ask your question. If you are joining us through a computer or smartphone and you would like to press the raise hand button, then that will show as blue indicating your hand is raised, and I will call on you to ask a question. So we'll go ahead. Oh, sorry, before I jump in, I know we had a hand raise from John previously, just before, as we were wrapping up our last Q&A. John, if you still have a question you wanted to ask, please raise your hand again. Sorry, we couldn't get to you at the end of the last round. In the meantime, we'll take Jeff's question. Jeff Crockett, we have enabled you to speak. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, first of all, I would just like to thank Eli and the whole group who are responsible for putting this public engagement session together. I think it was exceptionally well run, and I appreciate that. And I'm just hoping there could be a follow-up to this later on. My question, though, I sent an email about concerns about a couple specific areas. One of them is East Summit, and I have another concern about the intersection of Division and High Street. My question is, to whom should people who have concerns about specific parts of this plan, to whom should these concerns be sent?
All right, thank you, Jeff. And I think that specific feedback on the plan can be provided to Eli Cooper, the project manager, and his email address will be on the slide, the last slide of the presentation. It is ecooper, COOPER, at a2gov.org. And Eli, if you'd like to add any other recommended contacts, please do.
Nope, we're keeping it simple, and I will take all comments and make sure they get to the proper party, either for inclusion in the plan or to an appropriate member of the city staff in order to provide response if it's a specific technical issue of current practices.
Great, thank you. And I don't see any other hands raised at this time. So Robert, if there aren't any other Q&A items to address, then we can probably turn it back over to Stacy for presentation.
Yep, over to Stacy.
And I think actually Jeremy will continue subbing in for Stacy on some of these slides, talking about the regional connectivity strategy elements. So this is just an element of the plan that recognizes that not all of Ann Arbor's transportation issues or transportation challenges can be met by thinking about things that happen within the borders of Ann Arbor, of course, just based on how many people are imported per day. And so one of the strategies talks about is to develop a citywide transportation demand management strategy. Again, this kind of focuses on that issue where really 94% of the delay that occurs in the system based on data, regional data, is really just during those morning and evening rush hours. So the downtown, the DDA and the RIDE have collaborated on the Go Pass program to really encourage people to consider alternative modes when getting downtown. This plan talks about the possibility of expanding that to be more of a citywide effort, an initiative working with employers. And part of that, of course, is looking into, again, transit-oriented development zoning so that as growth is targeted within the city, that it's transit-oriented growth. And then I think related to some of the comments about inner city and regional services, this plan does express support for continued investment in facilities that support that within the city and also working with partners such as the Regional Transit Authority on additional services that can access Ann Arbor from the outside. Of course, there has been the successful service to the airport, the air ride, as well as a service that started to be piloted right around the time that the pandemic hit, serving back and forth on an hourly basis trips along the I-94 corridor to Detroit. So continuing to innovate and support activities that get people into Ann Arbor or provide options for people trying to get into Ann Arbor on a daily commute basis. Continued planning for the Amtrak station is also on the list and something that could potentially support future regional rail service into Ann Arbor as well. So getting back into metrics and targets for this category, really looking at that share of commute trips that come in and out of Ann Arbor on transit. Right now, the data shows about 11% of trips coming in and out of Ann Arbor using transit. We're looking to double that by 2030. So by offering those types of additional services, giving those services priority in terms of accessing some of the key employment areas, looking to be able to double that amount of that proportion of people using transit to get in. And then again, as I talked about, the Go Pass program has been successful for the downtown. So looking to continue to expand on that. So there's about 5,000 people a year that use that today. So expanding that potentially or some version of that citywide. It wouldn't necessarily work the exact same way, but doubling the amount of people that work in the city that are part of a program that encourages other uses and incentivizes it through their employer. I think We have one more exercise, Stacy, looking at the metrics and doing polling on those as well. So looking for your input again on using that Menti polling to tell us whether you agree and how you feel about these as kind of some key metrics that would be used by the city in measuring success on this plan going forward. So right now, just as a reminder, for those who may have joined or those who are looking to refresh their memories, go to www.menti.com and the code is 7047607.
And this will be our last polling session. So if you're feeling a little bit of polling fatigue, never fear, there's light at the end of the tunnel. And we just have 2 questions here. So I'll go ahead and advance. There are only 2 metrics for regional connectivity. So let us know if you support, how well you support these metrics. We'll give it just a few more moments, and the final question we have is a little bit different. Okay. So this final question is asking you to rank the following metrics by importance. And what we did here was we took the metrics that were the top ranked by the Community Advisory Committee in terms of their effectiveness. So these were the top 5 overall that the Community Advisory Committee thought. So we would like to see you all rank them by importance. So I'll just read them off. First, we have the share of serious injuries and fatalities incurred by people walking and biking, share of trips made by walking, biking, and transit, transportation costs as a percentage of household income, miles of gaps in the sidewalk network, and share of commute trips on transit. So I believe that you should be able to kind of drag these around until you have the order that you would like to see. And I'll give this one just a few more moments and we'll go into our final Q&A. And I can leave this up and people can continue to play around with the ranking while we begin answering questions. So that will remain active, and I'm just going to switch the screen share and I'll turn it back over to Robert.
Thank you, Stacy. Again, thank you everyone for hanging in there and appreciate you sharing your time with us. We've gotten a couple of questions regarding that's kind of COVID related, but a lot of people asking what considerations have we given in the data for the increase in remote work that's likely to occur, both because of COVID, but also long-term reasons coming out of COVID, that this becomes a viable option for more people.
So this is Eli Cooper again. The reality is nobody can precisely predict the future. The data that the plan is derived from showed us pre-COVID conditions. The crash locations, the types of projects are responsive to those areas where we have a priority. Even with a lower volume, these are likely still to be a priority. And what will happen is we will have to carefully monitor changes in society. Are folks more or less likely to ride transit or bicycle going forward? So there are ways that we can look at this as an emphasis, but the focus on safety, mobility, accessibility are important, and we're going to have to adapt. The good thing about planning is it's a process. This reflects where we were. We're going to adjust it based on what we know today, and we'll continue to monitor it as we implement it moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Eli. And this could be for both Eli and or Stacy. We've gotten a couple questions related to parking and how we are coordinating with the University of Ann Arbor when it comes to their parking needs, and also in regards to parking when it comes to parking prices and the impact that has in regards to equity. So people who have to travel into the city, how those parking prices impact them.
So we, in the pricing strategy, we do have a qualifier in there about limiting the effect of parking, any pricing strategy on low-income residents. So for instance, there could be a tiered system of parking pricing so that low-income residents are not disproportionately affected. Eli, I think I will let you chime in on the university parking.
Well, there's a longstanding relationship dating back decades to the city and the university collaborating and cooperating to the extent that we can on parking and transportation matters. The work that has been conducted, for example, on what was described as the U of M connector or the Ann Arbor connector was a four-party partnership of looking at trying to address parking and transportation for access both into the various university campuses and the communities downtown, with intercept parking provided at City's Edge. So without a specific project or program, the university as a multi-headed organization that has a medical demand that is growing, and they've had their own expansion and parking needs that they've addressed. But make no mistake that we at the city recognize that the university travel affects both our roadways and our transportation systems, including parking, and that we continue to work with them to achieve the best that we can for our mutual best interest. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Eli. That's helpful. We got a question regarding responses to the survey. They're asking, for example, would prioritization rating for share of commute trips by walking, biking, transit equate to a recommendation to update zoning, adopt transit-oriented development, and other land use recommendations?
I believe you're referring to that final question on the ranking of the metrics. So we already have some recommendations in there regarding land use, zoning, and transit supportive land uses. And the ranking question there at the end was really to give the city an idea of what is the most important to the public, what is the most important metric to be measuring according to the public. But I believe we already address a lot of everything that is proposed as a metric has recommendations supporting that metric already in the document.
Thank you, Stacy. And let's go. We've got one other, it's a more technical question, Stacy. It says, is the VMT measurement including the outside boundary portion of trips that the ICLIE says we're supposed to count? Oh, apologies. I believe we're having a technical issue.
Eli, is that something you'd be able to jump in on, that question? If maybe Robert can repeat the question again.
So, well, I'm looking at the question relative to outside the boundary portion. I'm going to have to defer back to the team because I'm not sure of the context of VMT as it's referred to within our document, but that the intent for the city's plan is to address the VMT within the city. And although I do understand the acronym or ICLEI and the context of overall greenhouse gas emissions and environmental parameters, that the whole trip counts, that the VMT statistics that are our target are within our jurisdiction.
All right, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and take a hand raise we have from Councilmember Griswold. Councilmember Griswold, I have enabled your microphone if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask a question or share a comment.
Okay, thank you. I'm really excited about this plan. I've been talking about Vision Zero, seems like for a decade now. And I just want to mention a couple of areas that I really am impressed with. One is the use of metrics throughout, and second, crosswalk lighting. Anyone that knows me knows I've been talking about crosswalk lighting. So I'm glad that's included in the plan. I do have one question. Given that Vision Zero focuses on reducing deaths and serious injuries of all roadway users, I'm wondering if somewhere in the plan we mention people who are riding in vehicles. I know that they're not the more vulnerable of our roadway users, but I sort of see a death as a death regardless of who the person is. And I just want to make sure that we get buy-in from the total community and that we're considering deaths of people in vehicles.
Thank you, Councilmember Griswold. So the question for the team is regarding the inclusion of considerations for people riding in vehicles in the plan and how that is addressed relative to Vision Zero.
So I'm going to jump into this one first and acknowledge that as the city's transportation program manager, that this plan was framed for the entire community. Recognize that there's been a focus on vulnerable road users. However, when you look at the tier 1, tier 2 priority corridors for safety, those were based on vehicle-to-vehicle crashes. And so make no mistake about it, that the priority recommendations are framed around the vehicle system. Now, clearly, if a vehicle has contact with a pedestrian or cyclist, the outcome for the vulnerable user is more severe. But we have not excluded. As a matter of fact, we have included as a priority the vehicle realm. If you look at the recommendations in the plan, you'll see recommendations that result in safer conditions for all. The types of road geometric changes address vehicle safety. Slower speeds enable drivers to pay more and better attention. Some of the human factors are distracted driving. Again, resulting from distracted driving is a vehicle crash. So although we don't typically spend a lot of time talking about it, so I appreciate the question, allowing to enumerate some of the emphasis areas in the document for the vehicle community. This is not a one-sided plan where we're just trying to make the roadways safer only for pedestrians and or bicyclists, but for all users, all citizens, all visitors, all travelers within our city. Thank you.
Thanks, Eli. And Robert, would you like to take any other questions from the Q&A window or turn it back over to Eli for next steps?
Thank you, Kayla. There are some other questions related to some more recent street changes, but I think we can answer those via email because they're generally not gone into detail in this plan. So I'll pass along to Eli.
Okay, just having a little trouble unmuting, and I want to start by thanking everyone for joining us here this afternoon. I know as we got to the 2 o'clock hour, folks were worrying about whether we made a huge mistake by having a mid-afternoon public meeting. Turned out we had good attendance, so thank you all for joining us. A question came up earlier that I covered quickly. I'll take a little more time to walk through it. We are currently responding to the first or the initial draft plan that was placed up on the city's website about a week or so ago. And we would like public comments, feedback by November 13th. The reason for that is the statutory review process for an element of a city master plan requires that the document be authorized for release to county, adjoining municipalities, and industry stakeholders for a review prior to consideration for adoption. That statutory review process will be based on the revisions to the draft that is currently on the website. So we're taking input from you, the general public, as part of this meeting. Comments to me at my email address by November 13th will be factored into that. We anticipate being ready to present an updated document, including the responses to comments that we've received to the Transportation Commission at its meeting in November. If we're able to hit that times point, we're tentatively looking at a City Planning Commission meeting December 1st. That would be the beginning of the statutory county review process. Without going through details, the county and adjoining communities are allowed a couple of months to review and provide us feedback so that we're looking at late winter, early spring in having feedback, if any, from industry stakeholders, the county or adjoining communities. That will result in the draft final plan. And at that point, it's the real draft final plan that will be, as a matter of necessity, introduced to our Transportation Commission. Statutorily, it has to go to the Planning Commission for its consideration. They will consider adopting it. The City of Ann Arbor will then, City of Ann Arbor charter requires that the City Council approve the master plan elements. And so after the commission will adopt it, it goes to the council, and the council can either accept or reject with notes. And that's something that will happen later in the spring. I would anticipate that, well, not I would anticipate that there is a public hearing that will be convened by the Planning Commission as a part of the formal final plan adoption. And we will make sure to notify everybody who's participated in the general public engagement in this planning process over the course of the last year will be notified of that public hearing date. That's what we have for next steps. Unfortunately, although it feels like we have a draft plan and we're ready to launch ahead, the institutional inertia and statutory responsibility will keep us working on this for the next 3 to 5 months, depending on how well the review processes go. Thank you again for coming out this evening or this afternoon. And I think we have a couple of minutes left. I'm not sure if we wanted to tackle another question or two, or I'll turn it back to Robert, Stacy, and Kayla.
Thanks, Eli. We do have a couple of questions that we could get into. And you mentioned the VMT earlier, and someone followed up and asked, is the VMT related to GHG or reducing volume of traffic? What if all travel was by solar powered electric vehicles, for example?
So we didn't really talk about it, but in Ann Arbor, we'd use the expression A2 for Ann Arbor A squared. This is the Vision Zero. There's also the A20. So we have A20 squared, and the sustainability framework speaks to elimination both of 50% of the VMT and a conversion of 50% of the remaining vehicles to an electric fleet. So the question is an important one to recognize, that we're looking both for a reduction in overall VMT within the community, as well as a reduction or elimination of carbon fueled vehicles moving forward as described in the A20 plan. But this transportation plan, as a component of the city's master plan, is intending to be consistent with the actions that council has already taken by adopting the A20 program. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Eli. And I'll pass it on to Kayla.
Thanks, Robert. So we don't have any other hands raised for questions, but what I would like to do is to relaunch the demographic questionnaire. So a few participants who were in the meeting early were able to complete this already. This is an optional and anonymous demographic questionnaire. It helps the city understand who we're hearing from at our public meetings. That helps us then understand who we are not hearing from, so we can make better efforts to provide more inclusive engagement. I'll be launching that polling shortly, but I ask that you please do not complete this if you already completed the poll at the beginning of the meeting. This is just to catch those who may not have been present yet or missed that opportunity. So the poll is now on the screen in front of you. Please answer those 8 questions and hit submit at the bottom. We also welcome your feedback about the engagement format. You'll see that last question, what would make it easier for you to engage with the city? So if you have feedback about the engagement format that we used in this meeting today, or how you would like the city to provide engagement opportunities in the future, we welcome that. So please take a moment to complete those questions before you head out. And otherwise, I'm not sure whether it's going to be Stacy or Eli, but one of the two cover the contact info on the slide in front of you and close out the meeting. Thank you.
Well, again, Stacy did a lot of the heavy lifting, so I think I can share with folks that I am the project point person as city staff. My phone number is on the screen, extension 43710. The email again, Cooper, COOPER @a2gov.org. And any more information, if you're interested in the detail behind the public engagement process, the individual surveys, it's all posted on the project website, which is available at www.a2gov.org/vision0. Again, I really do want to express my appreciation for all of you who have joined us. Plan is as good as the team that produces it and the community that engages in it. We believe that we have been well served, not only by your participation today, but in my experience here with the city over a decade and a half. We literally had thousands of responses to the online surveys as we move forward. So this is not just sticking our finger up in the wind saying, what should we do? Which way is the wind blowing? But we're building a plan that's responsive to the input and the values of our city. And we look forward to your feedback to see how close to on point we are. And hopefully we'll interact with many, if not all of you, over the next 3 to 5 months as we move forward into the formal plan adoption process. Again, I would say get home safely, but I suspect that everyone is already at home. Just stay safe and have an enjoyable holiday season coming up. Bye now.